The dust swirled thick behind Silverbrook's only saloon on that scorching August afternoon in 1885, but it couldn't hide what Cole Mitchell saw when he rounded the corner to water his horse. A child, no more than 12 years old, stood tied to a weathered fence post like a scarecrow left to rot in the sun. Her bare feet were caked with mud, her thin arms stretched above her head, and her wrists bore the angry red marks of rope that had cut too deep for too long. Cole Mitchell had seen plenty of cruelty in his 40 years on this earth. He'd fought in wars, buried a wife, and learned that the world could break a man in ways he never expected. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the sight of that little girl standing silent and still, while grown men gambled away her future like she was nothing more than livestock. What happened next would challenge everything the people of Silverbrook thought they knew about justice, family, and what it truly meant to save someone's life. This is the incredible true story of Emma Rose, a child who'd been sold to pay her father's gambling debts, and Cole Mitchell, the broken-hearted rancher who chose to see her worth when everyone else saw only property. The Wyoming Territory in 1885 was still wild enough that a man could disappear into its vastness and never be found, or never want to be. Cole had chosen this isolation after losing his beloved wife Mary to consumption 3 years earlier. His ranch, Mitchell Homestead, sat 20 miles northwest of Silverbrook, nestled between two protective ridges that kept the world at arm's length. Cole stood 6 feet 2 inches in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of sorrow and hands calloused from the kind of work that kept grief at bay during daylight hours. His dark hair showed premature gray at the temples, and his gray eyes held the careful distance of a man who'd learned that caring too much could cost everything. He'd ridden into Silverbrook that day for supplies and tool repairs, a routine trip he made monthly to maintain his connection to civilization without getting too close to its complications. The plan was simple: drop off dulled blades at the blacksmith, pick up coffee and flour at the mercantile, maybe share a drink with the few men who still remembered him from before he became a ghost haunting his own life. But fate had other plans. The crowd behind the saloon was small but ugly, the kind of men who gathered when someone else's misery promised entertainment. They weren't all bidding on Emma Rose. Most were just curious about the spectacle of a man desperate enough to use his own child as collateral in a poker game gone wrong. But their presence made the whole scene feel like a carnival where the main attraction was human suffering. Cole's horse had stopped before he'd even pulled the reins, as if the animal could sense something fundamentally wrong with the scene before them. For a long moment, Cole sat in the saddle, watching and listening, trying to understand how a world that claimed to value innocence could allow something so barbaric to happen in broad daylight. The girl, Emma Rose, though Cole didn't know her name yet, never lifted her head. She stood with the resigned stillness of someone who'd learned that fighting only made the pain worse. Her dress was little more than rags, her hair hung in unwashed tangles, and everything about her posture spoke of a spirit that had been systematically broken by people who should have protected her. $12 for the girl, called out a voice from the crowd. 1 week's labor, or permanent. Your choice. She's small, but she don't eat much and won't give you trouble. The man doing the selling was thin and sour-smelling, with the desperate energy of someone whose luck had run out long ago. He tugged on Emma's rope like she was livestock, grinning with teeth that were more gaps than enamel as he tried to drum up interest from the sparse crowd. She can clean, cook a little, and she's stronger than she looks, he continued. Silent as a stone, too. Won't talk back or cause problems. Cole felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest as he listened to a child being sold like a piece of farm equipment. This wasn't just wrong. It was evil, pure and simple. And in that moment, Cole Mitchell made a decision that would change 2 lives forever. He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the dusty ground with deliberate purpose. Without a word, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of honest money earned through honest work. $15, Cole said quietly, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur like a blade through silk. The seller's eyes lit up with greed. You want her for the week? No, Cole replied, his gray eyes steady and cold. Permanent. But I'm not buying her. I'm settling your debt. There's a difference. The man's grin widened as he caught the coins Cole tossed him. Same result, mister. She's yours now. But Cole was already moving, pulling his pocket knife and cutting the ropes that bound Emma Rose to the post. Her arms fell too fast and she staggered as circulation returned to her limbs. Cole caught her, not roughly, but not tenderly either. She looked up at him with eyes that held no hope, no gratitude, no emotion at all. Just the hollow acceptance of someone who'd learned that one master was much the same as another. Can you ride? Cole asked quietly. Emma nodded once, a quick, economical movement that spoke of a child who'd learned to conserve energy for survival. They left Silverbrook under a sky-threatening storm, Emma riding Cole's pack mule while he led his horse on foot. She didn't sit behind him. Cole had enough sense to know that a child who'd been through what she'd endured would need space and time to trust again. She clung to the saddle horn with white-knuckled fingers and kept her face turned away from the road, as if looking back might somehow drag her into the nightmare she was leaving behind. Dust rose behind them like ghosts reluctant to let go, and somewhere in that swirling cloud of earth and memory, Emma Rose began the long journey from victim to survivor. She didn't know it yet, but the man walking beside her mule had just given her something more valuable than freedom. He'd given her the chance to remember what it felt like to be treated like a human being. The Mitchell homestead appeared before them as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Emma Rose looked ahead instead of behind. The Mitchell homestead sat in a valley protected by two rocky ridges, where cottonwoods grew thick along a creek that ran clear and cold even in the driest summers. The main house was modest but well-built, with a stone chimney that spoke of warm fires and windows that caught the last light of day like golden promises. A barn weathered to silver gray stood nearby, and beyond it, pastures where cattle grazed in the peaceful rhythm of a life lived close to the land. Emma Rose took it all in with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate each new place for potential dangers and escape routes. She saw the unlocked doors, the absence of bars on windows, the way Cole moved with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing to hide and no one to fear. Cole led her into the house without ceremony, pointing to a cot near the fireplace that was already made up with clean blankets and a pillow that smelled of lavender instead of fear. A pot of beans bubbled on the stove, filling the small space with warmth and the promise of a meal eaten sitting down instead of grabbed between punishments. That's yours, Cole said simply, nodding toward the cot. You hungry? Emma nodded once, the same careful movement that conserved energy and drew no unnecessary attention. Cole ladled beans into a tin bowl and set it on the wooden table, along with a spoon and a chunk of bread that was still warm from the oven. Take your time, he said, settling into a chair across from her. No one's going to take it away. Emma sat but didn't immediately reach for the spoon. She stared at the food as if it might vanish or transform into something else. A punishment, a trick, a test she was destined to fail. When she finally picked up the spoon, her movements were slow and deliberate, the actions of someone who'd forgotten what it meant to eat without fear. The first taste made her flinch, not from heat, but from flavor. Real flavor, rich and warm and filling. Cole realized with a pang that she'd been surviving on scraps for so long that a simple bowl of beans tasted like a feast. She didn't finish the bowl, setting down the spoon when she was only halfway done, and looking up at Cole with something that might have been shame. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might bring punishment down on both of them. You can have more if you want it, Cole said gently. There's plenty. Emma shook her head quickly. I should save some for later. The words hit Cole like a physical blow. This child had been living with such uncertainty that she couldn't imagine there would be another meal tomorrow, or the day after that. She'd been conditioned to hoard, to fear, to expect deprivation at every turn. There'll be more later, Cole said, his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. Not at her, but at everyone who'd taught her to think this way. There'll be breakfast tomorrow, and lunch, and dinner. Every day. Emma stared at him as if he'd just claimed the sun would rise in the west. Trust was clearly not something that came easily to someone who'd been betrayed by every adult who should have protected her. Cole stood and poured himself coffee, looking out the window as if the vast Wyoming landscape might offer answers to questions he wasn't sure how to ask. "I don't lock doors," he said finally. "Never have. If you want to leave, no one's stopping you. But if you stay, you're safe here." Emma nodded but didn't move from her chair. She seemed frozen between disbelief and desperate hope, as if accepting his words might somehow jinx the fragile possibility of safety he was offering. "What do I call you?" Cole asked, returning to his seat. The question seemed to surprise her. She was quiet for so long that Cole thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Emma. Emma Rose." "That's a good name," Cole said, and meant it. "I'm Cole Mitchell. This is my place." Emma nodded, filing away this information with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that survival often depended on remembering details that others might overlook. As the evening wore on, Cole busied himself with small tasks, banking the fire, checking the windows, preparing for the night routine of a man who lived alone. Emma watched his every movement, cataloging his habits, looking for signs of the volatility that she'd learned to expect from the men who controlled her fate. But Cole moved with the steady patience of someone who had nothing to prove and no anger to unleash. He spoke quietly when he spoke at all, his words chosen carefully and delivered without threat or demand. When he handed Emma a washcloth and pointed toward the basin of warm water he'd prepared, it was an offer, not an order. "You can clean up if you want," he said. "There's soap there and a clean dress that might fit better than what you're wearing." Emma looked at the dress, simple blue cotton that had once belonged to Cole's wife, and something in her expression shifted. Not quite hope, but perhaps the absence of despair. "It was my wife's," Cole said quietly. "She'd have wanted someone to get use out of it." "Where is she?" Emma asked, the first question she'd volunteered since arriving. "Died 3 years ago. Consumption." Emma nodded with the solemn understanding of someone who'd learned early that loss was a constant companion. "I'm sorry. Thank you." They were quiet after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Not the heavy quiet of fear, but the lighter stillness of two people learning to be comfortable in each other's presence. When Emma finally went to wash, Cole stepped outside to tend to the animals and give her privacy. The evening air was cool and sweet with the scent of sage and grass, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate with a song that spoke of home and safety and all the simple things that made life worth living. When Cole returned to the house, Emma was curled on the cot wearing the blue dress, which was too large but clean. She'd braided her hair back from her face, revealing features that spoke of intelligence and strength beneath the careful mask of submission she'd learned to wear. "Dress fits well enough," Cole observed. Emma smoothed the fabric with hands that shook slightly. "It's the nicest thing I ever wore." The simple statement broke something open in Cole's chest. This child, this brave, broken child, had been living a life so bare of kindness that a simple cotton dress felt like luxury. "Well," he said, settling into his chair by the fire, "you'll have nicer things in time. Good things come to people who've earned them." Emma looked at him with those two old eyes. "How do you know I've earned them?" "Because you're still here," Cole said simply. "Because you survived what would have broken most people, and you did it with grace. That's earned, Emma Rose. That's earned 10 times over." She didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. And when Cole woke up briefly in the middle of the night to check the fire, he saw that she was sleeping peacefully for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. Outside, the Wyoming winds sang through the cottonwoods with a sound like whispered promises. Inside the warm house, a healing had begun, slow and tentative, but real. Two broken souls had found each other in the vast wilderness of grief and loss, and together they were learning that sometimes the most profound rescues happen not in dramatic moments, but in the quiet offering of safety, dignity, and hope. Emma Rose didn't know it yet, but she was home. Morning came gentle to the Mitchell homestead, with sunlight filtering through the windows like honey poured slow and golden. Emma woke before dawn, not from nightmares this time, but from the simple rhythm of someone whose body had learned to rise with the sun as a matter of survival. She lay still on the cot, listening to the sounds of a house at peace, the soft crackle of dying embers in the fireplace, the distant lowing of cattle, and somewhere outside, the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood. Cole was already up, working in the barn when Emma finally ventured outside. She found him mucking stalls with the methodical patience of a man who found comfort in routine work. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor. "Morning," he said simply, not stopping his work. "Coffee's on the stove if you want some. Bread's in the tin." Emma nodded but didn't immediately return to the house. Instead, she stood watching Cole work, noting how he moved around the animals with quiet confidence, how his voice gentled when he spoke to the horses, how he treated every living thing with the same careful respect. "I can help," she said finally, her voice still barely above a whisper. Cole paused, leaning on his pitchfork. "You don't have to earn your keep, Emma. Not anymore." "I know," she said, and something in her tone suggested she was beginning to believe it. "But I want to. I don't like being useless." Cole studied her face, seeing past the careful submission to the strength beneath. This child had survived by making herself valuable, by proving she was worth keeping alive. The habit would be hard to break, but maybe if he was careful, he could help her understand the difference between being useful and being valued. "All right," he said finally, "but we work together, partners." The word partners hit Emma like a physical blow. No one had ever called her that before. Partners implied equality, respect, choice. She nodded quickly, afraid that speaking might somehow break the spell. Cole showed her how to feed the chickens, how to collect eggs without frightening the hens, how to check the water troughs and mend small tears in the feed sacks. Emma absorbed every lesson with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that knowledge was survival, but Cole could see something else in her attention. Genuine interest, even joy, in the simple act of caring for living things. They worked in comfortable silence until the sun climbed high enough to make the barn stuffy. Then Cole led her back to the house for breakfast. Real breakfast, with eggs and bacon, and bread thick with butter and jam. Emma ate slowly, still unable to fully believe that the food wouldn't be snatched away. But with each bite, some of the hollow desperation in her eyes began to fill. "You said you had a brother," Cole said gently, remembering fragments of whispered conversation from their first night. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Had, past tense. What happened to him?" Emma was quiet for so long that Cole thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, carefully, as if each one cost something precious. "Tommy was older, 14 when Papa lost us both in the same game." She set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "They separated us right away. Said siblings cause trouble. Try to protect each other." Cole felt that familiar cold anger settling in his chest, but he kept his voice gentle. "How long ago?" 2 years, maybe 3. Hard to keep track." Emma's fingers worried at the edge of her napkin. "I kept thinking maybe I'd see him somewhere. Maybe we'd end up in the same place, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Cole could read the rest in her expression. Hope was a luxury that children in Emma's situation couldn't afford for long. "What was he like?" Cole asked. For the first time since arriving, Emma's face lit up with something approaching a smile. "Smart. Really smart. He could read anything, solve problems nobody else could figure out. And he was funny, always making jokes, even when things were bad. Sounds like a good brother." "The best." Emma's voice grew soft with memory. "He used to tell me stories at night when we were scared, made up ones about places where kids like us could be safe, where families stayed together." Cole nodded, filing away this information about the girl's capacity for love and loyalty despite everything she'd endured. Maybe he's still out there somewhere, telling those stories to other kids who need them. Emma looked up sharply as if the possibility of her brother's survival was something she'd forced herself to stop considering. "You think so?" "I think smart, funny people have a way of surviving," Cole said honestly, "and I think brothers who love their sisters don't give up easy." Emma didn't respond, but something in her posture had shifted, a tiny loosening of the rigid control she maintained over hope and heartbreak. After breakfast, Cole decided to tackle repairs on the fence line, and Emma asked to come along. They rode out together on horseback, Emma on the gentle mare that had once been Mary's favorite, Cole on his sturdy gelding. Emma rode like someone who'd learned horseback was often the fastest way to escape danger, with natural balance and an intuitive understanding of the animal beneath her. The work was simple but satisfying, replacing rotted posts, tightening wire, reinforcing weak spots that winter storms had damaged. Emma proved surprisingly helpful, her small hands perfect for reaching tight spaces, and her sharp eyes quick to spot problems Cole might have missed. "You're good at this," Cole observed as Emma expertly twisted wire around a new post. "Papa taught me some before." Emma trailed off, then started again. "Before he got so bad with the cards, he used to say I had good hands for fixing things." He was right. They worked in comfortable silence after that, but Cole could see Emma processing something in the careful way she approached each task. Finally, as they were packing up tools, she spoke again. "Why did you take me?" she asked, her voice matter-of-fact rather than emotional. "Really? You could have just walked away?" Cole considered the question seriously. It deserved an honest answer. "I saw someone drowning," he said finally. "And maybe I was drowning too, in a different way. Sometimes helping someone else is the only way to help yourself." Emma studied his weathered face, looking for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once and returned to packing the tools. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Emma did something that surprised them both. She began to hum, softly, almost under her breath, a simple melody that spoke of longing and memory. It was the first time Cole had heard her make any sound that wasn't strictly necessary for communication. "What's that song?" he asked gently. Emma's humming stopped abruptly, as if she just realized she was making music. "Something Tommy used to sing. I didn't realize I was—" "It's pretty," Cole said. "Don't stop on my account." Emma looked at him uncertainly, then began humming again, a little stronger this time. The melody filled the small house with something it had been missing since Mary died. The sound of someone being unselfconsciously human, making beauty simply because beauty wanted to be made. As the fire burned lower and the evening settled around them, Cole realized that something fundamental had shifted. Emma was no longer just surviving in his house, she was beginning to live in it. And for the first time in 3 years, the silence that had been his constant companion was starting to feel less like solitude and more like peace. Outside, the Wyoming wind carried the promise of changing seasons. Inside, 2 damaged souls were learning that healing didn't happen all at once. It happened in small moments, quiet gestures, and the gradual recognition that safety could be real, kindness could be trusted, and home could be built from the simplest materials. Respect, patience, and the revolutionary idea that every person, no matter how small or broken, deserved to be treated with dignity. Emma Rose was learning to trust again, and Cole Mitchell was learning that saving someone else might just be the first step toward saving yourself. 3 weeks into their new life together, trouble arrived at the Mitchell homestead with the deliberately slow approach of men who expected to be obeyed. Cole saw them coming long before they reached the gate, 3 riders moving with the kind of confidence that came from believing the law was on their side. The morning had been peaceful until then, with Emma helping him repair a section of barn roof while humming that simple melody that had become the soundtrack to their healing. The sight of the approaching riders made Cole's jaw tighten with recognition and dread. He climbed down from the roof slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, despite the cold anger beginning to build in his chest. "Emma," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching men, "go inside." But Emma had already seen them, and something in her posture told Cole she knew exactly who was coming. She'd gone rigid with the kind of stillness that spoke of prey trying to avoid a predator's notice. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered. "Marcus Webb." Cole's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle leaning against the barn wall. "You know that name?" "He's the one who really owns me," Emma said, her voice hollow with the resignation of someone who'd always known this moment would come. "Papa owed him money from way back. He let Caleb, my papa, keep me as long as the debt got paid down, but Marcus always said he'd collect eventually." The 3 men dismounted with theatrical precision. The first wore a preacher's collar, crisp and white despite the dusty ride. His eyes held the cold fire of a man who'd confused righteousness with cruelty. The second was clearly a lawman, badge glinting in the morning sun, mustache trimmed to military precision. And the third, Marcus Webb himself, moved with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no and lived in a world where money could buy anything, including children. "Mr. Mitchell," the preacher called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of the pulpit. "I'm Reverend Blackwood. This is Deputy Carlson and Mr. Marcus Webb. We've come about the girl." Cole stepped forward, placing himself between the men and the house where Emma had reluctantly retreated. "What about her?" Marcus Webb spat into the dust and fixed Cole with the kind of stare that was meant to intimidate. "That child is stolen property, mister. Her father owed me a considerable debt, and she was collateral, legal collateral." "She's not property," Cole said, his voice level but carrying an undertone of danger that made smart men reconsider their approach. "She's a child." Deputy Carlson stepped forward, one hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Be that as it may, Mr. Mitchell, the law sees things differently. Without proper guardianship papers, you're harboring someone else's asset." "Asset," Cole repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "That what you call a 12-year-old girl who's been beaten and starved and sold like livestock?" Reverend Blackwood's smile was as cold as winter wind. "Your moral outrage is noted, sir, but irrelevant. The child was legally pledged as surety for debt. Mr. Webb has documentation." Marcus Webb reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, waving it like a flag of conquest. "Bill of sale, witnessed and recorded. That girl belongs to me, fair and square." Cole's gray eyes had gone hard as stone. "Show me." Webb handed over the document with obvious satisfaction. Cole read it carefully, his jaw tightening with each line. The paper was real enough. Legal language that reduced Emma Rose to property, signed by a desperate father and witnessed by men who should have known better. "This says she was collateral for a gambling debt," Cole said finally. "It doesn't say anything about ownership." "Debt wasn't paid," Webb replied smoothly. "Collateral becomes property. That's how it works. Not in Wyoming territory, it doesn't." Cole folded the paper and tucked it into his own pocket. "We don't recognize slavery here, documented or otherwise." Deputy Carlson's hand moved closer to his weapon. "You're interfering with lawful business, Mitchell. That's a crime." "What's criminal is grown men buying and selling children," Cole shot back. "But since you seem to think the law matters, I'll give you 7 days to come back with a proper court order. Real paperwork, not this garbage you're waving around." Reverend Blackwood's face flushed with indignation. 7 days? You have no authority to— 7 days, Cole repeated, his voice carrying the kind of finality that ended arguments. "Come back with a judge's signature, or don't come back at all." Marcus Webb's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake, Mitchell. That girl's been nothing but trouble since the day she was born. Father drank himself to death trying to forget he had her. Mother ran off when she couldn't take the shame anymore. Nobody wants her except as cheap labor." Cole took a step forward, and something in his movement made all three men tense. "Get off my land." 7 days, Deputy Carlson said, trying to salvage some authority from the situation. "But after that, if you're still harboring stolen property, I'll arrest you myself." They mounted up and rode away, but the threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Cole watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "I heard," she said simply. Cole nodded. "Figured you would. They'll come back, and next time they'll bring papers that look real enough to fool most folks. Probably." Emma stepped onto the porch, her small hands clenched into fists. "I won't go back to him. I'd rather die first." The quiet conviction in her voice hit Cole harder than any threat Webb could have made. This child, this brave, broken child, had found something worth fighting for, and she was prepared to die rather than lose it again. "You won't have to," Cole said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "We'll figure something out." "How?" "You heard them. They've got law on their side, documentation, witnesses. What do we have?" Cole looked at her standing there in the blue dress that had once been Mary's, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear in her eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. What they had was simple but powerful: truth, justice, and the unshakable belief that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. "We have time," he said finally. 7 days to find another way. That evening, Cole rode into Silverbrook alone, leaving Emma with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the rifle close. The town that had seemed merely rough around the edges during his previous visit now felt actively hostile, as if word of Webb's claim had already begun to spread through the saloon gossips and courthouse hangers-on. Cole's first stop was the telegraph office, where he sent urgent messages to every lawyer, judge, and territorial official he could think of. Most would probably ignore him, but it only took one sympathetic ear to start building a case for Emma's freedom. His second stop was more personal. Tom Bradley, his nearest neighbor, and one of the few men in the territory Cole trusted, lived on a spread 5 miles south of town. Tom had fought alongside Cole in the territorial conflicts of the 70s, and his word carried weight with the kind of men who valued honor over legal technicalities. "They'll be back," Cole told Tom over coffee in the rancher's kitchen. "And when they come, they'll have papers that look official enough to fool most folks." Tom nodded grimly. "Webb's got connections in Denver, judges who owe him favors. Won't be hard for him to get something that passes for legal. So what do we do?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if answers might be floating in the dark liquid. "Well," he said finally, "seems to me the law's got two sides. Webb's side, which is about money and documentation, and our side, which is about doing what's right." "Our side?" Tom looked up with the kind of smile that had gotten them both into trouble during their Army days. "You didn't think you were fighting this alone, did you? That girl's got more friends in this territory than Webb does, and some of us have been waiting for an excuse to remind him that money can't buy everything." As Cole rode home under a star-filled sky, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope backed by the knowledge that he wasn't facing this fight alone. Emma Rose had found more than just a home at the Mitchell homestead. She'd found a community willing to stand between her and the men who saw her as property. The next 7 days would test every one of them. But for the first time since Webb's visit, Cole allowed himself to believe that justice might just have a chance against money, and that a 12-year-old girl's right to safety might prove stronger than a legal document signed by desperate men in a world that had forgotten how to protect its most vulnerable. When he reached the homestead, Cole found Emma exactly where he'd left her, sitting by the fire with the rifle across her knees. She looked up as he entered, searching his face for signs of hope or despair. "Well?" she asked. Cole hung his hat on its peg and settled into his chair. "Well, turns out you've got more people willing to fight for you than Webb's got people willing to fight for him." Emma's eyes widened with something that might have been wonder. "People want to help me? People want to do what's right," Cole corrected gently. "And keeping you safe, keeping you free, that's what's right." For the first time since Webb's visit, Emma smiled. It was a small smile, fragile as morning frost, but real. And in that moment, Cole knew that whatever the next 7 days brought, they would face it together, not as owner and property, but as family. On the 4th day of their 7-day reprieve, a wagon appeared on the horizon, moving slowly, as if the driver was uncertain of her destination or afraid of what she might find at the end of her journey. Cole spotted it first while checking the fence line, and something about the solitary figure hunched over the reins made him urge his horse toward home faster than usual. Emma was hanging laundry when the wagon finally pulled into the yard, and at the sight of the woman climbing down with careful, pained movements, the wet shirt in Emma's hands fell forgotten to the dust. "Mama!" The word came out as barely a whisper, as if speaking it too loudly might shatter the impossible vision before her. The woman was perhaps 30, but life had aged her in the way that grinding poverty and endless worry could age someone. Her dress was patched but clean, her hair was streaked with premature gray, and her hands shook as she reached toward the daughter she'd thought was lost forever. "Emma Rose," she breathed, and then they were in each other's arms, both crying with the desperate relief of people who'd learned not to hope for miracles and then received one anyway. Cole stayed back, giving them space for a reunion he understood was sacred, but he watched carefully, noting the way Emma's mother, Sarah rose. She introduced herself when she could speak again, moved with the careful deliberation of someone still healing from injuries, both physical and emotional. "I've been looking for you," Sarah said, stroking Emma's hair with trembling fingers. "Ever since I got free, I've been traveling from town to town, asking questions, following rumors. When I heard about what happened in Silverbrook." She looked up at Cole then, her eyes holding the kind of gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for saving my baby." Cole nodded, uncomfortable with praise for doing what any decent person should have done. "She's been saving me too, if I'm being honest." Sarah smiled at that, the first genuine happiness Cole had seen in her weathered features. "She's always been like that, even when she was tiny, always trying to take care of everyone else." Over the next few hours, Cole learned Sarah's story in fragments shared between tears and laughter. She'd been sold alongside Emma and Tommy when their father's gambling debts reached impossible heights, but to a different buyer, a man who ran a boarding house in Denver that was barely more than a prison for women who had nowhere else to go. "I tried to fight it," Sarah said, her voice hollow with old pain. "Tried to keep us together, but they said families were trouble. That split up we'd be more manageable." She'd spent 2 years in virtual slavery, working 18-hour days for no pay, while the boarding house owner took a cut of everything she earned through cooking, cleaning, and mending for his tenants. It was only when a fire damaged the building and forced everyone to relocate that Sarah had found her chance to slip away in the chaos. "I had Emma's button," Sarah said, reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a small wooden button carved with a flower. "From her favorite dress. I kept it with me the whole time, promised myself I'd find her and Tommy and make us a family again." Emma took the button with reverent care, turning it over in her palm like a talisman. "Tommy carved this for me," she said softly. "Said every princess needed jewelry, even if we couldn't afford real jewels." The mention of Tommy brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. "I haven't found him yet. Asked everywhere, followed every lead. It's like he just disappeared." Cole saw the way Emma's face closed off at this news, watched her carefully tuck the button into her pocket next to her heart. The reunion with her mother was a miracle, but the absence of her brother remained a wound that might never fully heal. "We'll keep looking," Cole said quietly. "Sometimes people turn up in the strangest places, when you least expect it." Sarah looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't dared hope that anyone else might care about finding her lost son. "You'd help us look for Tommy." "Family's family," Cole replied simply. "And it seems to me you're all family now." That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, sharing the first meal the three of them had eaten together, Sarah brought up the subject they'd all been avoiding. "Emma told me about the men who came," she said carefully, "about Webb's claim and the 7 days." Cole nodded grimly. 3 days left. I've sent wires to every lawyer and judge I can think of, but Webb has money and connections," Sarah finished. "I know his type. They think owning papers makes them right." "We could run," Emma said quietly, the first time she'd spoken since her mother's arrival. "All three of us. Head west, find somewhere they'd never think to look." Sarah reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Running's what we've been doing for 2 years, baby girl. I'm tired of running." "Then what do we do?" Emma asked. Cole had been thinking about this question for days, turning over possibilities and discarding them one by one. Most of the legal avenues seemed blocked by Webb's money and influence. But there was one option that might work, risky, unconventional, but potentially effective. "There's one thing we haven't tried," he said slowly. "Marriage." Both women stared at him in confusion. "Not me and Emma," Cole clarified quickly, seeing Sarah's protective instincts flare. "Me and you, Sarah. If we were married, I'd have legal guardianship rights over Emma. Webb's papers wouldn't mean much against a husband's claim to protect his stepchild." Sarah blinked, processing this unexpected proposal. "You'd do that? Marry a stranger to save my daughter?" "Wouldn't be to save her," Cole said honestly. "Would be to save all of us. This place has been dead for 3 years, ever since Mary passed. You two brought it back to life. Seems to me that's worth protecting." Emma looked between them, hope and uncertainty warring in her expression. "But would it be real? The marriage, I mean." Cole and Sarah exchanged a long look across the table. In it was the recognition of two people who'd both lost everything and found something unexpected in the wreckage. "Real as we want it to be," Sarah said quietly. "Real as kindness and respect and choosing to build something together can make it." Cole nodded. "I'm not looking for romance, Sarah. Lost that part of myself when Mary died. But partnership, family, a home where people take care of each other, that I can do." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Cole's weathered face. "You're sure about this? Once we say those vows, there's no taking them back without a lot of legal trouble." "I'm sure," Cole said. "Question is, are you?" Sarah looked at Emma, who was watching them both with the intensity of someone whose entire future hung on this moment. Then she looked around the warm kitchen, taking in the evidence of the life Cole had built, the solid furniture, the well-stocked pantry, the sense of safety that permeated every corner of the house. "Yes," she said finally, "if you'll have us, Cole Mitchell, we'd be honored to be your family." They were married 2 days later in the Silverbrook courthouse, with Tom Bradley and his wife serving as witnesses and the justice of the peace looking slightly bewildered by the rushed ceremony. Emma stood between them wearing a new dress Sarah had somehow managed to acquire, her face radiant with the kind of joy that comes from seeing impossible dreams become reality. When Webb and his men arrived the next morning, exactly 7 days after their first visit, they found a very different situation than they'd expected. Cole met them at the gate with legal papers of his own, a marriage certificate and guardianship documents that had been filed with the territorial court. "She's my stepdaughter now," Cole said simply, handing Webb the papers. "Legal and binding. Your claim's worthless." Webb's face went through several interesting color changes as he read the documents. "This is fraud," he sputtered finally. "A sham marriage designed to circumvent legitimate debt collection." "Prove it," Cole replied calmly. "Take it to court if you want. But until a judge says otherwise, Emma Rose Mitchell is under my protection as her legal guardian." Deputy Carlson studied the papers with the careful attention of a man who knew when he was outmaneuvered. "These look legitimate," he said finally. "Because they are," Cole replied. Reverend Blackwood made one last attempt at moral authority. This union was clearly contracted for convenience, not sanctity. The Lord frowns upon such arrangements. Sarah stepped onto the porch then, wearing one of Mary's dresses, altered to fit her slender frame, her hair neatly braided and her chin raised with quiet dignity. "The Lord also frowns upon grown men buying children," she said clearly. "I think he's more concerned with protecting the innocent than preserving your business arrangements." Webb stared at her for a long moment, recognizing something in her face that made his confidence waver. "Sarah Beth Porter," he said slowly. "I heard you died in Denver." "Sorry to disappoint you," Sarah replied coolly. "But as you can see, I'm very much alive, and very much married to a man who won't let you hurt my daughter." There was a long, tense silence. Then Webb slowly folded the marriage certificate and handed it back to Cole. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Cole replied. "And if I see you on my property again, without an invitation, you'll regret it." After the men rode away, Cole, Sarah, and Emma stood together on the porch, watching the dust settle behind their departing horses. Emma was the first to break the silence. "Are we really safe now?" she asked. Cole looked down at this child who'd become his daughter in every way that mattered, then at the woman who'd chosen to trust him with her most precious treasure. They weren't the family he'd expected to have, but they were the family that fate and circumstance and their own brave choices had created. "We're really safe," he said, "all of us." And for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, that safety felt permanent, protected not just by legal documents, but by the unbreakable bonds of people who'd chosen to love and protect each other through whatever storms might come. They were home. 6 months after the wedding, life at the Mitchell homestead had settled into the comfortable rhythms of a real family. Sarah had proven herself not just a devoted mother, but a capable partner, managing the household finances with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to make every penny count. Emma had grown 2 inches and gained the healthy roundness that came from regular meals and the absence of fear. She'd also begun attending the schoolhouse in Silverbrook 3 days a week, her quick mind soaking up reading and arithmetic with the hunger of someone who'd been denied education for too long. Cole found himself whistling again as he worked, something he hadn't done since Mary's death. The house felt alive in ways it hadn't for years, filled with Sarah's quiet humming and Emma's occasional laughter, and the simple domestic sounds of people building a life together. It was Sarah who first smelled the smoke. "Cole," she called from the kitchen window where she was washing breakfast dishes. "Look toward the ridge." Cole stepped outside and immediately felt his stomach drop. A line of orange glow was moving across the eastern ridge like a slow-burning fuse, pushed by winds that had been building since before dawn. Wildfire in late summer was every rancher's nightmare, uncontrollable, unpredictable, and capable of consuming everything a family had built in a matter of hours. "How close?" Sarah asked, joining him on the porch with Emma right behind her. Cole studied the smoke patterns and wind direction with the careful attention of someone who'd fought fire before. "Close enough. We need to move stock to the north pasture and get the important papers ready to travel." They spent the morning in controlled urgency, driving cattle away from the fire's likely path, while Emma helped Sarah pack their most precious belongings into wooden crates. The marriage certificate went in first, followed by Emma's button from Tommy and the few photographs that remained of their various pasts. By afternoon, the fire had jumped the ridge and was racing down the slope toward their valley with frightening speed. The sky had turned an ominous orange-brown, and ash began falling like gray snow on everything they'd worked to build. "We need to go," Cole said, loading the last of their emergency supplies into the wagon. "Fire's moving faster than I expected." But as they prepared to leave, Emma suddenly bolted toward the barn. "Emma!" Sarah screamed, but the girl was already inside the smoke-filled building. Cole ran after her, finding Emma in the tack room, frantically searching through old equipment. "What are you doing?" he shouted over the roar of approaching flames. "Tommy's letters," Emma cried, pulling a small wooden box from behind a saddle. "The ones he wrote me before. I hid them here so they'd be safe." Cole grabbed the box in Emma's hand, pulling her toward the door as burning embers began to fall through gaps in the barn roof. They made it to the wagon just as the wind shifted, sending the fire racing directly toward the house. They drove hard for the creek bottom, where the water might stop or slow the flames' advance. Behind them, the Mitchell homestead, their home, their sanctuary, their new beginning, disappeared into a wall of orange fury. They spent the night camped by the creek, watching their world burn. Emma sat between Cole and Sarah, all three of them covered in soot and ash, staring at the glow on the horizon that marked everything they'd lost. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered finally. "If I hadn't gone back for those stupid letters—" "They weren't stupid," Sarah said firmly, pulling her daughter closer. "They were from Tommy. They mattered." "Besides," Cole added, "house was already gone by then. Fire would have taken it whether you'd gone back or not." Emma opened the wooden box with trembling fingers, revealing a handful of carefully folded papers covered in a child's careful handwriting. She handed one to Sarah, who read it by the light of their campfire. "Dear Emmy," Sarah read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "I hope this letter finds you safe and warm wherever you are. I dream about you every night and tell myself stories about the day we'll see each other again." She couldn't continue, overcome by the love that radiated from her son's words even across the years and distance. "He's alive," Emma said with quiet certainty. "I can feel it, and someday we'll find him." Cole looked at these two remarkable women, his wife and daughter, chosen family forged in crisis and sealed with love, and felt something settle in his chest. The house could be rebuilt, the barns could be replaced, but this bond between them, this determination to keep hoping and fighting and loving despite everything the world threw at them, this was unbreakable. "We'll find him," he agreed, "and when we do, we'll have stories to tell him about how his sister saved his letters from a wildfire and his mother married a stubborn rancher who loves them both." In the morning, they returned to survey the damage. The house was gone, reduced to a blackened stone foundation and a chimney standing like a grave marker. The barn was a total loss, along with most of their equipment and supplies, but the land itself remained, scarred but not destroyed, waiting for the patient work of rebuilding. Tom Bradley arrived before noon with a wagon full of supplies and 3 neighbors ready to help clear debris. By evening, 6 more families had shown up with food, tools, and the kind of practical generosity that frontier communities were known for. "We'll help you rebuild," Tom said simply. "That's what neighbors do." As they stood looking at the ruins of their old life, Sarah took Cole's hand. "Are you sure about this? Starting over from nothing again?" Cole looked at Emma, who was already making plans for where the new chicken coop should go, her resilience undaunted by temporary setbacks. Then he looked at Sarah, this woman who'd traveled hundreds of miles to find her children and ended up saving him in the process. "We're not starting from nothing," he said. "We've got each other. Everything else is just construction." They rebuilt through the autumn, raising a new house that was bigger than the old one, big enough for the family they hoped to continue growing, and with an extra bedroom for the son they still believed would come home someday. The community pitched in with labor and materials, creating something stronger and more beautiful than what the fire had taken. Emma started school full-time that fall, her teacher marveling at how quickly she caught up with children who'd never missed a day of education. Sarah took over the ranch's bookkeeping completely, her careful management allowing them to expand their herd and improve their breeding stock. And Cole learned that healing could happen twice in one lifetime, that love could grow in unexpected soil, and that sometimes the best families were the ones you chose rather than the ones you were born to. On Christmas morning, as they sat around their new fireplace opening simple gifts and sharing the kind of laughter that comes from genuine contentment, Emma made an announcement that surprised them all. "I want to change my name," she said, legal-like. "Emma Rose Mitchell. I want to belong here forever." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Baby, you already belong here. You don't need papers to prove that." "I know," Emma said, "but I want the papers anyway. I want everyone to know that Cole's my papa, and this is my home, and nobody can ever take me away again." Cole felt his throat tighten with emotion. This child, this brave, incredible child, had chosen him as surely as he'd chosen her that day behind the saloon. And now she wanted the world to know it. "Well then," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "I guess we'd better make it official." They filed the adoption papers on New Year's Day, 1886, with Emma Rose Mitchell's signature carefully practiced and proudly written. As they left the courthouse, Emma slipped her small hand into Cole's calloused one. "Thank you, Papa," she said simply. Cole squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for choosing me, daughter." And somewhere in the vast Wyoming territory, in a place none of them could yet imagine, a young man named Tommy Rose was telling stories to other lost children about the day families could be reunited and broken things could be made whole again. The story was far from over. But this chapter, this beautiful, impossible chapter of love conquering cruelty and family triumphing over tragedy, was exactly as it should be. They were home. They were safe. They were together. And that, Cole Mitchell knew as he looked at his chosen family, was worth more than all the gold in the mountain streams and all the cattle on the endless plains. They had everything that mattered. By 1890, Emma Rose Mitchell had grown into a young woman of 17, with her mother's quiet strength and her adoptive father's unwavering sense of justice. The scared, broken child who'd been tied to a post behind a Silverbrook saloon had transformed into someone who carried herself with the confidence of a person who knew she was loved unconditionally. Her dark hair caught sunlight like silk, her eyes held the intelligence that came from education and opportunity, and her hands, once thin from hunger, were now steady and capable from years of meaningful work. The Mitchell homestead had prospered beyond anyone's expectations. Cole's careful breeding program had produced some of the finest cattle in Wyoming territory, and Sarah's meticulous financial management had allowed them to purchase additional land and expand their operations. More importantly, their home had become a beacon of hope for families in crisis throughout the region. But despite all their success and happiness, Tommy's absence remained an ache in Emma's heart that time hadn't diminished. Every letter that arrived at the post office made her pulse quicken with hope. Every stranger who rode through Silverbrook caught her attention as she searched familiar features for traces of the brother she remembered. Every night, she still whispered prayers for his safety before falling asleep. It was Sarah who first suggested they take a more active approach to finding Tommy. "You're old enough now to handle the truth," she told Emma one evening as they worked together in the garden, harvesting the last tomatoes before the first frost. "And we have resources we didn't have before. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for Tommy to find us and start looking for him ourselves." Cole looked up from where he was repairing fence posts nearby. The suggestion didn't surprise him. He'd been thinking the same thing for months. Emma had grown into someone who needed purpose beyond the ranch, and finding her brother would give her the kind of meaningful quest that matched her restless intelligence. "I've been thinking about hiring a detective," Cole said, setting down his hammer. "Fellow named Harrison Bradley, no relation to that preacher who caused us trouble, works out of Denver. Used to be a Pinkerton man before he started his own agency. Specializes in finding missing persons." Emma's hands stilled on the tomato vines. "You do that? Spend that kind of money?" "Emma Rose," Sarah said gently, "you're our daughter. Finding your brother isn't spending money, it's investing in our family's future." Cole nodded agreement. "Besides, we can afford it now. And if there's any chance Tommy's out there looking for you the same way you're looking for him, we owe it to both of you to try everything." That autumn, Harrison Bradley arrived at the Mitchell homestead, a compact, sharp-eyed man in his 40s who carried himself with the careful alertness of someone who'd spent years tracking people who didn't want to be found. He listened to Emma's story with professional attention, taking detailed notes and asking questions that demonstrated both thoroughness and sensitivity. "The trail's cold," he said honestly after Emma had shown him Tommy's letters and described everything she remembered about their separation. 5 years is a long time, and children sold into labor have a way of disappearing into the shadows. But I've found people with less to go on." "What do you need from us?" Cole asked. Bradley pulled out a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the kitchen table. "First, I'll need this story told in every newspaper between here and California. Missing person notices, reward offers, anything that might reach someone who's seen him or worked with him. Second, I'll need to retrace his movements from the beginning, track down everyone who was involved in the original sale, follow every lead, no matter how small." Emma studied the sample newspaper notices Bradley had brought. What if he doesn't want to be found? What if he's built a new life somewhere and doesn't want reminders of the old one? It was a question that revealed both maturity and the kind of deep love that puts another person's happiness before your own desires. Bradley looked at her with new respect. "That's always a possibility," he said honestly. "But from what you've told me about your brother, he sounds like someone who'd never stop looking for family. Most people in his situation spend their whole lives hoping for exactly what I'm offering, the chance to come home." Over the following months, Bradley's investigation began to bear fruit. He tracked down Caleb Porter, Emma and Tommy's father, to a pauper's grave in Colorado, dead of drink and despair 2 years after selling his children. He found Marcus Webb, now a broken man himself, serving time in a territorial prison for fraud and embezzlement. Most importantly, he began to trace the network of men who'd bought and sold children throughout the region. The picture that emerged was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Dozens of children had been trafficked through the same system that had claimed Emma and Tommy, some sold to work in mines, others to serve as unpaid labor on isolated ranches, still others disappearing into the anonymous misery of urban slums. But Bradley also found hope. A former telegraph operator in Colorado remembered a young man named Thomas who'd worked for the railroad briefly in 1888. A teacher in Utah recalled a student helper who'd been extraordinarily good with numbers and had spoken often of a sister named Emma. A newspaper editor in Nevada had employed someone matching Tommy's description who'd written stories about missing persons with unusual passion and skill. "He's alive," Bradley reported during one of his visits to the homestead. "And he's been looking for you, Emma. Every job he's taken has been chosen to give him access to information, telegraph lines, newspapers, schools where he might hear about other lost children. He's been conducting his own search." Emma felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched tight. "How do we find him?" "We make ourselves easier to find," Bradley said simply. "We put your story in every newspaper west of the Mississippi. We offer a reward large enough to get attention, and we wait for him to come to us." The campaign began in earnest in the spring of 1891. Emma's story appeared in papers from Denver to San Francisco, always accompanied by the same photograph. Emma, at 17, standing between Cole and Sarah on the porch of their rebuilt home, her face reflecting both the strength she'd gained and the hope she still carried. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from people who'd seen young men matching Tommy's description, from other families searching for lost children, from individuals who'd been sold into labor themselves and wanted to share their stories. Emma answered every letter personally, her correspondence becoming a lifeline for people throughout the West who'd experienced similar tragedies. But it was a letter from a newspaper editor in Carson City, Nevada, that changed everything. "Miss Mitchell," the letter read, "I believe the young man you're seeking worked for my paper, the Carson City Chronicle, for several months in 1890. He called himself Thomas Porter, never mentioned a sister named Emma, but his writing showed an unusual interest in stories about separated families. He left suddenly last spring, saying he'd received word about a lead he needed to follow. I still have some of his articles if you'd like to see them." Emma read that letter so many times the paper began to wear thin at the creases. Here was proof that Tommy was not just alive, but still searching, still hoping, still believing that family was worth pursuing across any distance. Cole and Bradley traveled to Carson City together, returning with a portfolio of articles Tommy had written, pieces about missing persons, reunited families, and the legal reforms needed to protect children from exploitation. Emma recognized her brother's voice in every line, the same intelligence and compassion that had comforted her through their darkest nights as children. "He's heading east," Bradley concluded after studying the timeline of Tommy's movements, "following leads, chasing rumors. The question is whether he's still traveling or whether he's settled somewhere to continue his search." That's when Sarah made the suggestion that would ultimately bring their family together. "What if we stop chasing him and start calling him home?" she said one evening as they sat around the fire, planning their next move. "What if we use his own strategy against him?" "What do you mean?" Emma asked. Sarah smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a complex puzzle. "Your brother writes about missing persons and family reunions. What if we gave him a story too good to ignore? What if we arranged for Emma's adoption story to be featured in every major newspaper as a human interest piece? Not as a missing person notice, but as an inspiring tale of a family choosing love over blood?" Cole immediately understood the brilliance of the plan. "Tommy reads newspapers professionally. If Emma's story appears in enough papers, especially with details only he would recognize, he'll know it's really me," Emma finished, her voice bright with excitement, "and he'll know exactly where to find me." They implemented Sarah's plan that summer. Emma's story, carefully crafted to include details only Tommy would recognize, appeared in newspapers throughout the West. The wooden button he'd carved, the songs he used to sing, the specific way he'd always called her Emmy instead of Emma, all were woven into a narrative that would serve as a beacon for the brother who'd never stopped searching. By autumn, the Mitchell homestead was receiving visitors from throughout the territory, reporters wanting to follow up on the story, other families inspired by their example, travelers who'd heard about their hospitality and wanted to experience it for themselves. Emma handled each visitor with grace and growing confidence, but Cole could see the tension building in her as days passed without word from Tommy. It was during this busy period that Emma made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I want to start teaching," she announced one evening over supper. "The new schoolhouse in Silverbrook needs a second teacher, and I think I could help children who've been through what I went through." Cole and Sarah exchanged glances. They'd always known Emma would leave the ranch eventually. She was too intelligent and ambitious to be satisfied with domestic life alone. But they'd expected her to marry first, or perhaps pursue nursing or some other traditionally feminine profession. "Teaching's a good profession for a woman," Cole said carefully. "But are you sure you're ready? It's a big responsibility." Emma's chin lifted with the stubborn determination they both recognized. "I've been ready since I was 12 years old and tied to a post behind a saloon. I know what it's like to feel powerless and abandoned. I want to make sure no child in this territory ever feels that way in my classroom." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Then we'll help you get the position. And when Tommy comes home, he'll find his sister making a difference in the world." Emma began teaching that fall, walking to Silverbrook 3 days a week and boarding with the minister's family on school nights. Her classroom became known throughout the territory for its warmth and inclusion. She had a particular gift for reaching children who'd been written off as difficult or unteachable, and parents began requesting that their most troubled young ones be placed in Miss Mitchell's care. But perhaps more importantly, Emma's work gave her a platform to speak about child welfare and protection. She became a powerful advocate for the territorial laws Cole had helped pass, traveling to other communities to share her story and encourage local officials to take child abuse seriously. It was during one of these speaking engagements in the spring of 1892 that Emma met Dr. James Thompson, a young physician from Boston who'd come west to establish a practice in underserved communities. He attended her lecture in Cheyenne, stayed afterward to ask thoughtful questions about trauma and healing, and left with an obvious admiration for both her message and the woman delivering it. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters. James was establishing his practice in a town 50 miles away, but Cole and Sarah could see the change in Emma as the correspondence deepened. She smiled more often, hummed while she worked, and began talking about the future with the kind of excitement that suggested she was no longer just waiting for her past to catch up with her. "He's a good man," Emma told them after James had visited the ranch for the first time. "He understands about family being more than blood, about building something meaningful from difficult beginnings." Cole liked the young doctor immediately, partly for his obvious devotion to Emma, but mostly for the way he listened when Emma talked about her work and her dreams. James never suggested that marriage should end her teaching career or limit her advocacy work. Instead, he talked about ways they could combine their efforts, using his medical knowledge and her experience to create programs that protected vulnerable children. When James proposed in the summer of 1893, Emma said yes with the blessing of parents who'd learned to trust their daughter's judgment. But she also made it clear that the wedding would wait until Tommy came home. "I won't start my new life until my old life is complete," she said simply. "Tommy has to give me away, or I'm not getting married at all." It was a decision that might have frustrated some men, but James understood. He'd seen too much of the world to believe that love could be hurried or that family bonds could be easily replaced. If Emma needed to wait for her brother, then they would wait together. As 1894 turned into 1895, the waiting became almost unbearable. Emma and James were deeply in love, ready to start their life together, but bound by Emma's unwavering loyalty to the brother who'd protected her through their darkest times. Letters continued to arrive from people who'd seen young men resembling Tommy, but none of the leads panned out. Then, in early October 1895, everything changed. A telegram arrived at the Silverbrook Telegraph office addressed to Emma Rose Mitchell. It was brief, almost cryptic, but Emma recognized the voice immediately. "Emmy, stop coming home. Stop your brother. Tommy, stop." Emma stared at the telegram until the words blurred through her tears. After 10 years of searching, 5 years of active investigation, and a lifetime of hoping, her brother was finally coming home. She ran from the telegraph office to the schoolhouse, where she announced to her startled students that school was dismissed early. Then she rode to the ranch faster than she'd ever ridden before, bursting into the house with news that would complete their family and fulfill a promise that love could overcome any separation. "He's coming," she told Cole and Sarah, waving the telegram like a victory flag. "Tommy's coming home." Sarah sank into a chair, overwhelmed by relief and joy. Cole whooped with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself. And Emma began planning a homecoming that would prove to her brother that the family he'd dreamed about during their darkest hours had become everything he'd hoped it could be. The boy who'd carved wooden buttons and sung lullabies was coming home to find that his little sister had grown into a woman who changed lives, that his mother had found love and security, and that the family he'd never stopped believing in was ready to welcome him back with arms open wide and hearts full of gratitude for his safe return. The circle was finally ready to close. 10 years later, in the golden autumn of 1905, visitors to the Mitchell homestead would find one of the most prosperous and welcoming ranches in Wyoming territory. The house that rose from the ashes of the 1885 fire had grown into a sprawling home, with wide porches and windows that caught every ray of available sunlight. The barns were painted red, the fences ran straight and true, and the sound of children's laughter echoed across pastures where prize-winning cattle grazed in contentment. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Mitchell family was what had happened on that crisp October morning in 1895, when the circle was finally completed. A lone rider had approached the homestead, tall in the saddle despite obvious fatigue, his clothes dusty from long travel. When he dismounted at the gate and pulled off his hat to reveal dark hair and eyes that held intelligence, humor, and the careful strength of survival. Emma Rose Mitchell dropped her basket of apples and whispered a single word that changed everything. Tommy? The young man, 26 years old and bearing the lean build of someone who'd worked hard for everything he'd ever gotten, broke into a grin that transformed his weathered features. Hello, Emmy. Sorry I'm late. Thomas Mitchell, as he now called himself, had spent 10 years working his way west, following rumors and pursuing leads, never giving up hope that he'd find the sister he'd loved and lost. He'd worked as a telegraph operator, a newspaper reporter, a school teacher, and a dozen other jobs, always listening for news of a girl named Emma, who'd been sold alongside her brother in a poker game gone wrong. It was a story in the Cheyenne paper about Territorial Representative Cole Mitchell and his successful campaign for child protection laws that had finally given him the clue he needed. I read about a man named Mitchell who'd adopted a girl named Emma Rose, he explained that first night. The family gathered around the table like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. I knew it had to be you. The reunion that followed was everything Emma had dreamed of and more. Within a month of Tommy's return, Emma and Dr. James Thompson were finally married in a ceremony that filled the Silverbrook Church to overflowing. Tommy walked his sister down the aisle with tears streaming down his face. And when the preacher asked who gave this woman in marriage, his voice rang clear and proud. Her family does, all of us, together. Thomas stayed, of course. He married a local school teacher named Margaret, started the Silverbrook Chronicle, and became the family's chronicler, recording not just their story, but the stories of other families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control and rebuilt through love, determination, and the simple, radical act of refusing to give up hope. Emma Rose Mitchell Thompson had grown into a remarkable woman who balanced teaching school with raising 3 beautiful children and helping run the ranch. Sarah had become the unofficial mother of Silverbrook, her silver hair and bright eyes marking her as someone who understood both loss and renewal. Cole had aged into the kind of respected elder that frontier communities treasured, a man whose word was his bond and whose home was always open to anyone in need. The Mitchell homestead became legendary throughout the territory, not just for its prosperity, but for its open doors. Runaway children, abused wives, men down on their luck, families separated by tragedy, all found their way to Cole and Sarah's table, where no one was turned away hungry and everyone was treated with the dignity that every human being deserved. The wooden box containing Tommy's letters was displayed in their parlor, next to Emma's carved button and a photograph of the original homestead before the fire. These artifacts told the story of a family that had been broken and scattered, then rebuilt stronger than ever through the revolutionary power of choosing to love and protect each other. Cole Mitchell lived to be 78, long enough to see his grandchildren grown and starting families of their own. Sarah followed him just 2 years later, unable to imagine a world without the man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. They were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the ranch, beneath headstones that bore a simple inscription: "They saved each other." Emma and Thomas carried on the family tradition of protecting the vulnerable and fighting for justice. The child protection laws that Cole had helped pass were strengthened and expanded, creating a legal framework that prevented the kind of systematic abuse that had nearly destroyed their family. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Mitchell family was the proof they offered that families could be built from love rather than just blood, that healing was always possible no matter how deep the wounds, and that sometimes the most profound rescues happened when broken people chose to save each other. As the camera pulls back over the sprawling Mitchell homestead one final time, we see 3 generations gathered on the front porch for Sunday dinner. Children playing in the yard where Emma once stood, broken and afraid, laughter echoing across the same valley where a desperate rancher once made a choice that changed everything. The setting sun paints the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and crimson, And somewhere in the distance, the sound of cattle calling to each other speaks of life continuing, hope enduring, and love conquering all. Emma Rose Mitchell learned that she was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth loving unconditionally. Her story proves that every child deserves safety, every family deserves the chance to heal, and every person, no matter how small or powerless they may seem, has the potential to change the world simply by refusing to give up hope. But here's what I want to know from you. What would you do if you encountered a child in Emma's situation today? Have you ever been part of a chosen family that proved love is stronger than blood? Have you witnessed someone's life completely transformed by a single act of kindness? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Wyoming like our heroes, somewhere else in the American West, or halfway around the world. Because stories like the Mitchells remind us that courage, compassion, and the power to change lives exist everywhere, in every community, in every one of us. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and the bell notification, because every week we bring you incredible true tales of ordinary people who chose to do extraordinary things. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their story isn't over, that healing is possible, and that sometimes the family we choose becomes the family that saves us. The next time you see someone who needs help, remember Cole Mitchell walking behind that saloon in Silverbrook. Remember that you have the power to be someone's turning point, someone's second chance, someone's miracle. Because the best stories aren't just about the heroes we admire. They're about recognizing the hero in yourself and the difference one person can make with a single act of love. Thanks for riding along on this incredible journey through the American frontier, where love conquered cruelty and family triumphed over tragedy. Until next time, keep believing in the power of chosen family, second chances, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Fade to black as the wind whispers through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the promise that some stories, the best stories, never really end. The snow whispered its secrets as it fell in thick, muffling waves, blanketing the high plains in a cold, indifferent embrace. The wind, sharp and biting, curled around the bare cottonwoods, their gnarled branches reaching like twisted fingers into the gray winter sky. Hooves crunched through the fresh powder, slow and deliberate, each step a quiet echo in the frozen wilderness. Isaac Wilder leaned into the chill, the brim of his battered hat pulled low, shadowing a face carved by years of sun and sorrow. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders, patched and stiff from too many winters and too few warm fires. A rifle balanced across his back, the leather strap creaking against his worn duster with every sway of his horse. He carried no badge, wore no brand. Only his eyes spoke, and even they had learned the language of silence. Ahead, smoke curled from the chimney of a small cabin, its thin line cutting through the ashen sky. Wilder reined in his horse, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The cabin sat alone, a lonely silhouette against the sprawling white, surrounded by a crooked fence and a sagging barn half buried in snow. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching into the ice-crusted earth, breath clouding around him like a ghost. He tied his horse to a bare pine, hand resting on the stock of his rifle, and moved toward the cabin with the careful steps of a man who had forgotten what it meant to feel at home. Isaac Wilder rode through the biting wind, his horse's breath steaming in the frigid air, the crunch of hooves on snow the only sound for miles. The landscape around him stretched stark and silent, white hills rolling into the distance, broken only by the jagged silhouettes of leafless trees. The sky hung low, thick with gray clouds that promised more snow before dusk. He pulled his hat down lower, the brim shielding his face from the bitter wind that cut through his worn coat like a knife. The rifle slung across his back felt heavier than usual, its weight a constant reminder of the choice that had brought him this far. He had left the warmth of the saloon 2 days ago, the echo of a whispered offer still ringing in his ears. A job that paid well, a deed with no papers, just a patch of land and a stubborn widow with a boy. The man's words had been soaked in whiskey and spite, his breath foul with the stench of cheap tobacco. "She's a squatter, a trespasser," the man had spat, waving a thick hand toward the distant hills. "Alone but for a boy. No deed, no claim. That land's mine by rights. Clear it, and you're paid." Isaac had taken the coin without a word, his jaw clenched, his eyes shadowed beneath the wide brim of his hat. The cabin came into view just as the sun slipped behind the hills, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. It was a modest place, logs weathered and darkened by seasons of harsh winds and hard rains. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and gray against the twilight sky, a lone thread of warmth in a frozen world. A small wooden cross leaned beside the porch, half buried in snow, its rough edges softened by the frost. Isaac's jaw tightened at the sight, a bitter twist pulling at the corners of his mouth. He had buried enough of his own to know what it meant to mark the dead. He reined his horse to a halt beneath a bare cottonwood, its twisted limbs reaching into the sky like the fingers of a drowned man. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching through the snow, as he led his horse behind a cluster of rocks. The animal's breath came in short, sharp puffs, ears flicking nervously at the silence that clung to the place. Isaac patted the mare's neck, his calloused fingers brushing the frost that had gathered in her mane. "Easy, girl," he muttered, his voice a rough whisper that felt out of place in the pristine quiet. He settled himself behind the rocks, rifle cradled across his lap, eyes fixed on the cabin. A faint light flickered in the single window, shadows moving inside. He watched as the door creaked open, a boy stepping out, his small frame bundled in a coat 2 sizes too big, the sleeves flapping as he stumbled down the steps. He carried a bundle of firewood against his chest, arms straining with the weight. Isaac's jaw tightened as the boy crossed the yard, his boots crunching softly in the snow. The child paused beside the small cross, his head bowing for a moment, his lips moving in silent prayer. Isaac felt something cold and sharp twist in his chest, a memory unbidden and unwelcome. The boy straightened, his breath fogging in the cold as he turned back to the cabin. Isaac watched him disappear inside, the door creaking shut behind him, the light in the window flickering once before steadying. He leaned back against the rough stone, letting the rifle rest against his shoulder, his mind churning with thoughts he had long tried to bury. The image of the boy, his small hands brushing snow from the cross, clung to his mind like a burr. As the night deepened, Isaac's fingers grew numb around the cold metal of his rifle. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the rough stone, the wind whispering through the branches above like the ghost of an old friend. His mind drifted, slipping into memories of a time before the land turned cold, before he had become a man who rode into the wilderness to do another man's dirty work. He saw his wife's face, her smile framed by the morning light streaming through their cabin window, the sound of her laughter mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire. He remembered the way her hand had felt in his, warm and strong, her fingers laced through his as they stood on the porch, watching their son play in the yard. The memory cut through him like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. When he opened his eyes again, the stars had emerged, their cold light stretching across the sky in a thin, fragile web. The cabin remained dark and silent, the smoke from the chimney curling slowly into the frigid air. Isaac shifted his weight, his knees stiff from the cold, his breath coming out in short, misty puffs. He tightened his grip on the rifle, the old metal biting into his palm, and leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as a shadow crossed the window. The woman, her figure bent over the stove, her hair pulled back in a loose braid that hung down her back, her movements slow and deliberate as she tended to whatever meager meal she had managed to scrape together. Isaac closed his eyes again, the cold settling deep into his bones. He would wait for morning, let the frost creep into his veins, let the silence wrap around him like a shroud. He had made his choice, taken the coin, accepted the weight of another man's grudge. But as he sat there, the snow gathering at his feet, the wind whispering through the trees, he wondered if he would find the strength to follow through when the time came. When he finally drifted into a restless sleep, it was not the cold that chilled him, but the sound of a child's whispered prayer lingering in his mind. The morning broke gray and brittle, the kind of cold that seeped into bones and made old wounds ache. Isaac woke slowly, his back stiff from a night spent against frozen stone, his breath fogging the air as he blinked away the remnants of troubled dreams. He flexed his fingers, feeling the slow return of warmth as blood crept back into his joints, and glanced toward the cabin. The smoke still curled from the chimney, thin and steady, a small, stubborn thread of life against the wide, indifferent plains. He reached for his rifle, the metal cold against his palm, and rose to his feet, stretching the stiffness from his legs. His horse watched him from the shadow of the rocks, her breath steaming as she stomped a hoof against the frozen ground, restless but obedient. Isaac patted her neck, whispering a few low, calming words before stepping away, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. The cabin door creaked open, and the boy stepped out again, his small frame hunched against the cold, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs as he trudged toward the woodpile beside the house. Isaac watched him work, the boy's movements careful and precise as he stacked the logs, his gloved hands moving with the slow, practiced rhythm of someone used to hard, unending labor. The boy paused once, glancing over his shoulder toward the tree line, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows before returning to his task. Isaac ducked back behind the rocks, his heart thudding in his chest, a long-buried instinct pushing him to stay hidden. When the boy returned inside, the door creaked shut, and the light in the window flickered as the fire was stoked back to life. Isaac leaned back against the rocks, his breath coming slow and measured as he steadied himself. He had faced down gunmen in smoky saloons, had ridden hard into ambushes with bullets whistling past his ears. But the sight of that small, solitary figure moving through the snow had shaken something loose in him, something he had thought long dead. An hour passed, the cold gnawing at his resolve, before the door opened again and the woman stepped out. She moved quickly, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her dark braid trailing down her back like a rope. She crossed the yard with purpose, her boots crunching through the snow as she made her way to the chicken coop. Isaac watched her pull open the small, sagging gate and bend low to collect the morning's eggs, her breath fogging the air as she muttered softly to the nervous hens. Her movements were quick, efficient, each step calculated to conserve energy in the biting cold. She straightened, her eyes drifting toward the tree line, and Isaac felt his breath catch as her gaze swept over the rocks where he hid. She paused for a moment, her head tilting slightly, as if sensing something out of place, then turned and hurried back to the cabin, the door creaking shut behind her. Isaac exhaled, his breath misting the air in short, jagged bursts as he let his head fall back against the stone. He closed his eyes, the rough texture of the rock pressing into his scalp, and tried to force his mind back to the task at hand. He had been paid to clear the land, to drive the squatters from their home, to put a bullet between the eyes of anyone who stood in his way. But now, with the image of the boy kneeling beside the small wooden cross burned into his mind, the weight of his rifle felt like a chain around his neck. As the sun crept higher in the sky, the cold began to break, the wind shifting from a bitter whisper to a slow, steady sigh. Isaac took a deep breath, feeling his lungs expand against the tightness in his chest, and forced himself to stand. He slung the rifle across his back, the metal cold against his spine, and took a step toward the cabin, his boots sinking into the softening snow. He would see this through, he told himself, if only to silence the small, stubborn voice that had begun to whisper doubts into his mind. He reached the edge of the clearing, the cabin looming before him, smoke still curling from the chimney, the windows glowing with the faint, flickering light of a fire. He paused, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle, and took a long, steadying breath. Then he stepped into the yard, his boots crunching through the snow as he approached the front porch. The small wooden cross leaned beside the steps, its rough edges weathered and worn, the snow around its base trampled by small, booted feet. The door creaked open, and the boy stepped out, his eyes going wide as he caught sight of the stranger standing in the yard. He took a half step back, his small hand tightening around the doorframe, his breath fogging the air as he opened his mouth to speak. Isaac held up a hand, his voice low and rough as he spoke. "I'm just passing through, looking for shelter." The boy hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the rifle slung across Isaac's back, then back to the man's face. He glanced over his shoulder, his small frame tense with uncertainty, before nodding slowly and stepping aside, the door creaking open wider to reveal the flickering fire within. Isaac stepped inside, the sudden warmth of the cabin wrapping around him like a thick, woolen blanket. He paused in the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the dim light as the boy closed the door behind him. The woman stood by the stove, her dark eyes sharp and wary, one hand resting on the handle of a heavy iron skillet. She met his gaze without flinching, her jaw set, her shoulders squared. "You alone?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Isaac nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "For now." The fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth creeping into his bones, chasing away the chill that had settled deep into his flesh. Isaac felt the weight of the rifle against his back, the cold metal pressing into his spine, a reminder of the choice he had yet to make. He glanced at the boy standing by the door, his small hands clenched into fists, his sharp eyes watching the stranger with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Isaac met the boy's gaze, his jaw tightening as the silence stretched between them. The crackle of the fire, the only sound in the small, dimly lit room. The morning light filtered through the small, cracked window, casting pale ribbons across the cabin floor. The fire had burned low during the night, its embers glowing like the eyes of old watchful spirits. Isaac stirred in the chair by the hearth, his limbs stiff, his back aching from the awkward, upright sleep. He flexed his fingers, feeling the roughness of calloused skin against the smooth grain of the rifle stock still balanced across his knees. The boy was already awake, moving quietly around the small space, his bare feet whispering against the worn wooden planks. He stoked the fire with a long iron poker, adding small dry sticks from the pile beside the hearth until the flames licked up hungrily, filling the cabin with a soft, crackling warmth. Isaac watched him through half-lidded eyes, his mind still fogged with sleep, the echoes of old half-remembered dreams clinging to the edges of his consciousness like smoke. The woman emerged from the small side room, her dark braid falling over one shoulder, her sharp eyes catching the firelight as she paused in the doorway. She glanced at Isaac, her expression guarded but not unkind, then moved to the stove, her movements quick and precise as she set a pot of water to boil. The boy watched her, his small hands folded in his lap, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if waiting for some unspoken command. Isaac straightened in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and cleared his throat. The woman's eyes flicked toward him, one brow arching slightly in silent question. He hesitated, his tongue thick in his mouth, the words slow to form. "Thanks for the shelter," he muttered, his voice rusty from years of silence. "Didn't mean to intrude." She nodded once, turning back to the stove as the water began to bubble, steam rising in thin, twisting tendrils. "A storm's a storm," she replied, her tone flat, matter-of-fact. "Nobody ought to be out in it alone." The boy glanced between them, his eyes sharp, curious. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it, his small shoulders hunching slightly as he looked down at his bare feet. Isaac felt a pang of something like shame twist in his gut, the boy's unspoken question hanging heavy in the warm fire-lit air. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and met the boy's wide-eyed gaze. "Name's Isaac," he said, his voice a shade softer. "Isaac Porter." The boy hesitated, his small hands clenching and unclenching in his lap, then glanced up at his mother. She gave a slight nod, her dark eyes flicking toward Isaac, then back to the pot of water on the stove. The boy took a deep breath, his thin chest rising and falling quickly, then spoke in a small, clear voice. "I'm Eli, and this is my ma, Anna." Anna's shoulders stiffened slightly at the introduction, but she didn't correct the boy, her hands moving steadily as she measured out a handful of dried herbs and dropped them into the pot, the sharp, clean scent of pine and sage filling the cabin as the leaves began to steep. Isaac nodded, his gaze shifting from the boy to the woman by the stove. "Appreciate the hospitality," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. "Ain't something I've seen much of lately." Anna didn't reply, her focus still on the small bubbling pot before her, the thin lines around her mouth tightening slightly at his words. Isaac leaned back in his chair, the worn wood creaking beneath him, and let his eyes wander over the small, neatly kept cabin. The walls were rough-hewn logs, their surfaces darkened by years of smoke and weather, the floorboards worn smooth by countless footsteps. A few small handmade shelves lined the walls, their rough edges filled with neatly folded linens and carefully arranged tin plates and cups. A single faded quilt hung over the doorway to the small side room, its edges frayed but meticulously mended. the patchwork pattern catching the firelight in soft, muted hues. Eli stood suddenly, his small, bare feet slapping against the cold, wooden floor as he moved to the small, glassless window beside the door. He peered out into the gray morning light, his breath fogging the cracked wax-papered pane as his sharp eyes scanned the snow-covered yard. He turned back to his mother, his small face tight with concern. "Ma, the fence is sagging again," he said, his voice low, anxious. "The post near the coop." Anna's brow furrowed, her hands pausing for a moment over the pot before she straightened, wiping her damp palms on her apron. She crossed the small space to the window, her dark eyes narrowing as she peered out into the cold, gray morning. "Damn wind," she muttered, more to herself than to the boy. "That post'll be the death of me yet." Isaac shifted in his chair, his spine creaking like the old weathered logs that framed the cabin walls, and cleared his throat. "I can fix it," he said, his voice low, cautious. Anna turned to him, her dark eyes sharp, searching his face for signs of deceit or hidden motives. Isaac met her gaze without flinching, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to hold her stare. "Ain't no trouble," he added, his voice a shade softer, almost apologetic. "I've mended worse." Anna hesitated, her sharp eyes flicking from Isaac to the boy beside her, then back again. She crossed her arms over her chest, her dark braids swaying slightly as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Finally, she gave a small, reluctant nod, her jaw tightening as if the words cost her something to speak. "All right," she said, her voice low, grudging. "If you're set on earning your keep, I won't stop you." Isaac pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting the sudden movement, and crossed the small space to the door. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the worn wooden handle, and glanced back over his shoulder at the small firelit cabin, the boy's wide eyes still watching him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He gave the boy a small, tight-lipped nod, then stepped out into the cold, gray morning, his boots crunching through the thin crust of ice that had formed overnight. Isaac's breath fogged the frigid air as he stepped out into the gray, brittle morning. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and biting, cutting through his worn coat and settling deep into his bones. He paused for a moment on the porch, his eyes sweeping over the snow-draped yard, the low, huddled shapes of the chicken coop and the sagging fence line just visible through the thin, gray haze. The storm had left its mark, snow piled high against the cabin walls, the wind-driven drifts forming jagged, icy shapes that clung to the base of the small, wooden structure like ghosts. The fence post Eli had mentioned leaned sharply to one side, its rough-hewn base half buried in the snow, the wire strung between the upright logs sagging dangerously low, the weight of the ice and wind-twisted branches pulling it down into the mud. Isaac stepped off the porch, his boots crunching through the thin, brittle crust that had formed overnight, and crossed the small yard, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the air burning his throat and lungs like cold iron. As he approached the fence, he noticed the thin, scattered tracks of small animals, their delicate, three-toed prints trailing through the snow like hurried signatures. A rabbit had burrowed beneath the low corner of the coop, its soft, gray fur leaving faint, wispy marks against the hard, wind-packed snow. He paused beside the sagging post, his gloved hand resting on the rough, splintered wood, and let his eyes wander over the yard, the thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin chimney, the dark, whispering line of trees that marked the edge of the forest beyond. He set his rifle down in the snow beside the post and knelt slowly, his knees cracking like dry branches, his gloved hands gripping the base of the leaning log. The wood was rough, splintered, its lower half darkened with rot and age, the iron nails driven into the grain rusted and loose, their heads sharp and uneven beneath his fingertips. He tested the weight of the post, rocking it gently back and forth, feeling the deep, stubborn resistance of the frozen earth that clung to its base like an old, bitter grudge. Eli's small, bare feet crunched through the snow behind him, the boy's thin shadow falling across the crooked fence as he approached. "Mama says the wire's too loose," he said, his voice small but steady, the words coming in short, quick bursts as he shivered against the cold. "She says it won't hold through another storm." Isaac glanced up at the boy, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, determined line of the child's jaw, the small, tightly clenched fists at his sides. He straightened slowly, his knees popping like distant gunfire, and reached for the worn, leather tool belt slung over his shoulder, his gloved fingers brushing the cold, hard edges of the iron nails and twisted lengths of wire nestled within. "She's right," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "But we can fix it. Just need a bit of elbow grease and some fresh timber." The boy's eyes brightened at that, his small, bare toes curling and uncurling against the cold, packed snow. He hesitated for a moment, his thin, shivering frame caught between the warmth of the cabin and the harsh, biting wind that whipped through the yard, then stepped closer, his small hands reaching for the rusted hammer and worn leather gloves Isaac held out to him. "Grab that end," Isaac said, nodding toward the loose, trailing length of wire that hung from the leaning post like a broken thread. "Hold it tight, keep it from slipping, and mind your fingers. This wire's got a mind of its own, and it don't much care for small hands." Eli nodded quickly, his small, thin fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, twisted wire, his small, determined face tightening with concentration as he braced himself against the sagging post. Isaac straightened, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs, the cold, brittle air biting at his exposed face and neck as he wrapped the end of the wire around the post and began to twist it tight, his gloved hands straining against the stubborn, rusted metal. The boy's thin arms trembled beneath the strain, his small, bare feet digging into the icy crust of the snow as he leaned his slight weight against the rough, splintered wood, his small, round face flushed with cold and effort. Isaac felt a small, unexpected pang of pride at the boy's quiet, determined strength, the thin, wiry muscles in his small arms standing out in sharp relief as he strained against the weight of the wire. They worked in silence for a long while, the only sounds the harsh, rhythmic creak of the wire as it stretched and tightened, the sharp, metallic clink of nails driven into splintered wood, the slow, labored breathing of two bodies bent against the cold. The sun crept higher in the sky as they worked, its thin, pale light glinting off the icy crust of the snow, casting long, jagged shadows across the yard as the thin gray clouds above began to break, their dark, heavy edges peeling back to reveal the pale, brittle blue of a winter sky. When the last nail had been driven into place and the wire pulled tight against the leaning post, Isaac stepped back, his gloved hands resting on his hips, his chest heaving with the cold, sharp air. He watched the boy for a moment, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, determined line of the child's jaw, the small, tightly clenched fists at his sides, and felt a small, unexpected warmth creep into his chest, the first faint, fragile stirrings of something like hope. "Good work, kid," he said, his voice low, rough, his gloved hand reaching out to clap the boy lightly on the shoulder. "Your ma's right. You've got the makings of a fine man in you, if you keep your head on straight." Eli's small, round face broke into a shy, crooked grin, his small, dark eyes bright with pride and relief as he looked up at the tall, weathered figure beside him, the thin, pale winter sun casting their long, crooked shadows across the snow-covered yard. The wind had a bitter edge to it that morning, a sharp, cutting cold that slipped through the gaps in Isaac's coat and bit deep into his bones. He stood at the edge of the yard, his breath fogging in the thin, icy air, his sharp, gray eyes fixed on the tree line just beyond the fence. The snow had settled deep in the night, laying a fresh, untouched blanket across the yard and fields, its surface marred only by the scattered, delicate tracks of small animals and the thin, winding trails of the wind that had whispered through the branches overhead. Isaac's fingers tightened around the cold, rough wood of the axe handle, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs as he watched the trees for any sign of movement, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the glare of the low winter sun. He had seen the tracks the night before, thin, delicate prints scattered along the edge of the yard, their sharp, three-toed shapes pressed deep into the fresh, white powder like small, hurried signatures. They had come close, closer than he liked. Small, sharp-eyed creatures, quick and cunning, their thin, brittle bones wrapped in wiry gray fur, their small, sharp teeth bared against the cold. He had heard them in the night, the soft, scratching sound of claws against wood, The faint, high-pitched yip of a young one calling to its pack. The slow, rhythmic crunch of snow beneath small, careful feet. He shifted his weight, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow, and stepped slowly toward the fence line, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the low, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the yard. The air was thin, cold, the sharp, metallic taste of iron and pine lingering in his mouth as he moved, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, the cold, brittle air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron. He reached the edge of the yard, his boots crunching through the thin, icy crust that had formed overnight, and paused for a moment, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, delicate line of fresh tracks scattered across the snow at the base of the fence. He knelt slowly, his knees cracking like dry branches, his gloved fingers brushing the cold, hard edges of the small three-toed prints. The sharp, delicate outlines pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust like old scars. He traced the line of tracks with his gloved hand, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the bright, brittle glare of the low winter sun as he followed the thin, winding trail through the snow, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs. The cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry winter wind. The tracks led toward the barn, their thin, delicate line winding through the snow like a thin, twisted thread. The small, sharp points of the claws pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust, their delicate, three-toed shapes scattered across the yard like small, hurried signatures. Isaac straightened slowly, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold, brittle air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, and gripped the rough, splintered handle of the axe tightly in his gloved hands, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the dark, shadowed shape of the barn door just a few yards away. He took a slow, measured step forward, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow, and crossed the yard, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the low, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the fence. The thin, winding trails of the wind whispering through the branches overhead, like the soft, slow breath of a dying man. He reached the barn door, his breath coming in short, quick gasps, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry winter wind, and reached for the rough, splintered handle, his gloved fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, hard wood as he pulled the door slowly open, the thin, sharp creak of the rusted hinges echoing through the still, silent air like a dry, brittle whisper. The interior of the barn was dark, the thin, pale light of the low winter sun filtering through the small, cracked windows and falling in thin, sharp lines across the cold, hard dirt floor. The air was heavy, damp, the sharp, metallic taste of rust and iron lingering in his mouth as he stepped slowly inside, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the threshold, the thin, sharp smell of old hay and dried blood filling his nostrils like a ghost. He paused for a moment, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the shadowed interior of the barn, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, and took a slow, measured step forward, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the threshold, the thin, sharp smell of old hay and dried blood filling his nostrils like a ghost. The small, sharp-eyed creatures were gone, their thin, wiry bodies slipping through the gaps in the rotting, splintered wood like smoke, their small, sharp teeth bared against the cold, their thin, wiry fur bristling against the sharp, biting wind that whispered through the cracks in the walls. He reached the back of the barn, his sharp gray eyes catching the thin, twisted line of fresh tracks scattered across the cold, hard dirt floor, their thin, delicate outlines pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust like old scars. Isaac straightened slowly, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the cold, brittle air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, and turned slowly, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the dark, shadowed shape of the open barn door just a few yards away, the thin, pale light of the low, winter sun filtering through the small, cracked windows and falling in thin, sharp lines across the cold, hard dirt floor. He tightened his grip on the rough, splintered handle of the axe, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the bright, brittle glare of the low winter sun as he stepped slowly out of the barn, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow, and crossed the yard, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the low, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the fence. The tracks led into the trees, their thin, twisted line winding through the snow like a thin, twisted thread. The small, sharp points of the claws pressed deep into the frozen, brittle crust, their delicate three-toed shapes scattered across the yard like small, hurried signatures. Isaac watched the tree line for a long moment, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron. Then turned slowly, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the snow-covered yard as he stepped slowly toward the cabin, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow. Isaac woke before the first hint of dawn, the cabin still wrapped in the cold, dark grasp of winter. The fire had burned low, the last embers pulsing faintly like a dying heartbeat beneath the gray ash. He pulled himself up from the rough wool blanket that had become his bed on the cabin floor, his joints stiff, his muscles aching from days of hard labor and long, silent nights. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, the faint, brittle sound of snow sifting from the branches like dry, rustling paper. The air was sharp and bitter, the kind of cold that settled deep into the bones and refused to leave. Isaac could feel it in his teeth, in the tightness of his chest, in the slow, dull ache that had taken up permanent residence in his lower back. He rose slowly, his breath fogging in the thin, icy air, and crossed the small, cramped space of the cabin, his boots scuffing against the rough, splintered wood of the floor. He reached for the small, battered stove, the iron surface cold beneath his calloused fingers, and stoked the dying fire, feeding it with thin, brittle branches and the last handful of dry kindling. The flames caught slowly, a thin, flickering line of orange that licked against the blackened iron walls of the stove, its faint, wavering light casting long, thin shadows across the walls of the cabin. He crouched beside the stove, his hands outstretched to the thin, feeble heat, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry, winter wind. He watched the flames for a long moment, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the thin, flickering light, his mind drifting back to the dream that had woken him. It had been the same dream, the one that haunted him every night, the one that followed him through the long, dark hours of winter and the slow, bitter days of spring. He had dreamed of fire, of smoke, of the sharp, acrid taste of burning flesh, and the thin, brittle sound of a woman's voice calling his name through the darkness. He had dreamed of blood, of pain, of loss, and of a promise he had made long ago, a promise he had never had the chance to keep. The fire crackled softly, the thin, sharp sound of the dry, brittle branches snapping and popping in the heat, and Isaac rose slowly, his joints creaking like old, rusted hinges. He crossed the cabin in slow, measured steps, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the floor, and reached for the battered leather satchel that hung beside the door. He pulled it down, the thin, cracked straps creaking beneath his calloused fingers, and opened it slowly, his sharp gray eyes scanning the contents with a practiced, careful gaze. Inside were the few belongings he had managed to keep over the years, the small, battered relics of a life that had slipped through his fingers like sand. He reached inside, his fingers brushing against the thin, worn leather of an old journal, the rough, splintered handle of a knife, the cold, smooth metal of a battered, tarnished badge. He pulled the badge free, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the thin, pale light of the rising sun as he turned it slowly in his hands, the small, engraved letters catching the light like old, forgotten promises. U.S. Marshal. The words felt strange in his mouth, bitter, metallic, like old blood. He turned the badge slowly in his fingers, his sharp gray eyes tracing the thin, delicate lines of the worn, tarnished metal, the small engraved letters that had once meant something, that had once stood for something, that had once marked him as a man of the law, a man of honor, a man with a purpose. He closed his fingers slowly around the badge, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the thin, pale light of the rising sun, and slipped it back into the satchel, the thin, cracked leather creaking beneath his calloused fingers like dry, brittle paper. He closed the satchel slowly, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry winter wind, and slung it over his shoulder, the thin, cracked straps digging into his shoulders like the weight of old regrets. He crossed the cabin in slow, measured steps, his boots creaking against the rough, splintered wood of the floor, and reached for the door, his gloved fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, hard iron of the handle. He pulled the door slowly open, the thin, sharp creak of the rusted hinges echoing through the still, silent air like a dry, brittle whisper, and stepped out into the cold, biting wind of the winter morning. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the thin, brittle crust breaking beneath his weight like old, dried bones, and he paused for a moment, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the snow-covered yard, the thin, twisted branches of the trees beyond the fence line, the thin, pale light of the rising sun catching the sharp, jagged edges of the ice that clung to the branches like shattered glass. He tightened his grip on the rough, splintered handle of the axe that hung from his belt, his sharp gray eyes narrowing against the bright, brittle glare of the low winter sun, and took a slow, measured step forward, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron. He crossed the yard in slow, measured steps, his boots creaking against the frozen, brittle snow, and reached the tree line, his sharp gray eyes sweeping over the thin, tangled brush that clung to the base of the tall, dark trees just beyond the fence. The thin, winding trails of the wind whispering through the branches overhead like the soft, slow breath of a dying man. He paused for a moment, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a dry winter wind, and reached for the battered, tarnished badge that hung from the strap of his satchel, his gloved fingers wrapping tightly around the cold, smooth metal as he stepped slowly into the trees, the thin, pale light of the rising sun casting long, thin shadows across the snow-covered ground, like old, forgotten promises. And as he moved through the trees, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs, the cold, sharp air burning his throat and lungs like a red-hot iron, he felt something shift inside him, something hard and brittle, something old and broken, something that had been locked away for far too long. And so, as the last embers of winter faded and the hard, bitter ground began to thaw, Isaac found something he'd thought lost forever, a purpose, a place to stand, and the quiet, stubborn promise of a second chance. But what do you think? Would you have trusted a man with a past like Isaac's? Do you believe someone can truly change when they have walked such a dark path? And where do you think this story should head next? Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what you think will come next for Isaac and his new family. I'd love to hear your thoughts as we keep this wild journey going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter.